Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and my guest today is Mustena Nazarian, an Alexander Technique teacher in Melbourne, Australia. She works a lot with musicians, and she also works with the general public in her teaching practice. And we're going to talk today uh, about a topic that I guess could best be defined as Alexander Technique teachers' attitudes and how they might get in the way of effective teaching and connection with their students. Mastana, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Robert.
Well, thank you. We've done quite a few podcasts. Um, in talking to you before we started, I think our starting point maybe was an earlier conversation, a podcast that I had with a New York teacher, Mark Josephsberg, on this question, and I think that raised some issues in your mind. Um, do you do you want to start by perhaps um, outlining a typical Alexander Technique teacher's attitudes, or maybe even a not so typical one that could be getting in the way of their teaching?
Well, I can only really know about my own attitudes since I don't have any way of knowing, any way of knowing other people's attitudes in their own practice.
Right.
Um, uh, although,
I think one
what?
can glean that, however,
Sure,
sometimes.
sure, but I mean,
Sometimes.
right here and right now, I think one thing that comes to my own mind is that um, when I'm presented with a challenge, a situation, teaching itself being that. I used to think that I had to work really hard to
Mm-hmm.
get to get to see some change. Boom, I had to see the change or I shouldn't be paid.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that I've learned to go into that space much less, and it's been a lot more rewarding to not seek the not seek even in my hands. It's like, oh, did I notice a change? Was I working hard enough? Did I pay attention hard enough? So to just let the exchange be what it is,
Mm-hmm.
and to take care of myself in sort of larger brush strokes
Right.
initially,
And
as it were.
I suppose in Alexander jargon, we could say that was sort of sticking to principle, right?
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and
and also
not worrying about results or your perception of
yeah.
results or your idea of what the person is thinking about, or are they getting irritated because nothing seems to be happening, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think one of the quotes I was reading recently in the corner of a book about Alexander Technique was Alexander's mentioning something to the effect of when you get the person to a place where they're unlearning, they're ready to unlearn rather than to learn,
Mm-hmm.
then you're sort of both ready to work with something.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you mentioned principles. So I think my first principle is actually to just sort of actually disregard the idea of principle, if that makes any sense.
Sure. Yeah.
Because that the presence of that person uh, next to me, in front of me, is actually more important than any set of principles. And if I can notice the lines in their face and the response in their eye, kind of above and beyond any set principle, then I can move forward. But if I'm kind of thinking, well, should I be doing more inhibition here or more direction, or should my hands be soft, or
Mm-hmm.
that actually gets becomes another step for me as a to undo. So
Right.
it's like,
Right.
actually, let me just be here right now.
Right. Well,
Um,
I identify totally with that issue that you bring up, especially when I first started teaching. But I still can get into that trap. And for me,
mm,
it's occasionally I'll have a new student coming for a first lesson who is, I guess, best described as a total blob in terms of any kind of self awareness or almost any kind of aliveness mentally, you know.
Hmm.
I'm sure you've run into that. Or maybe in Australia they don't exist. The pioneer culture and all. But and it doesn't happen very often. But sometimes I'll have a student and they're totally unresponsive in a way, and they don't sense anything. They sort of don't really interact very much, and then I'm kind of frustrated because I don't really know what to do, and I can get into all sorts of weird mental states. But is that have I assume you've run into that kind of thing, right?
Um, well, yeah, I am working with a wonderful young gentleman who has some cerebral palsy.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone was to observe our exchange, maybe they would say they would observe something like that. But I learned a lot from him in a way of not deciding for him what he's experiencing.
Right,
And
right.
and what I spoke about
I think
before.
that's key. What you just said,
Well, yeah, I mean what
not
I spoke about.
deciding for the student.
Yeah, yeah,
I think
exactly.
that is absolutely key. Yeah.
Um, what I expressed before about the first principle being to disregard the idea of principle, uh, didn't just come to me in a dream. I approach this work continually from many different angles, and well, look, during the past 2 years, I've probably done about 400 hours of martial arts practice, and I'm continue to learn a lot from that practice. Is that actually the quality of contact is only determined by me entering a certain kind of void.
Hmm.
And that might sound like the opposite of inhibition and direction or being present, but it's actually not because um, there's this very simple level of connection already present. And if every time I get bogged down with which principle and the set of principles and which direction and all of that, it actually gets in the way of noticing the really obvious. And the
Hmm.
really obvious is that it's an amazing thing that we're both here. And
Right.
we if we're here, that means we're ready to learn.
Hmm.
And if we're
Hmm.
here ready to learn, there will be an exchange. And hopefully there also be a misunderstanding. And I don't know what those misunderstandings or those understandings will lead to. I really don't know. But for me, the best thing I can do by myself is just to remain alive and actually become a little bit more alive so that I don't let the situation kill me.
So you right. So you put a value on the misunderstandings,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
and is that because um, misunderstandings indicate that there is some shift that's going to have to happen in order for there to be an understanding, and that's maybe what the teaching is about at that moment?
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear. I don't seek misunderstanding,
Right. But
but
when they happen, you embrace them.
yeah, many times I've been in a situation where I've gone, oh no, gosh, and I have to explain that again. What was that thing? And then I said, no, 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 stop. What what actually happened? What did I actually hear?
Hmm.
And can I just become a bit of a mirror, just feed that back to the person?
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
So that's an interesting kind of attitude issue that I had not thought of. Mark and I, when we had our conversation, talked about things like Alexander teachers sometimes being a bit arrogant and feeling they know things that other people don't know and that sort of thing, which you do see in the Alexander world. But you're bringing up something quite different in a way.
um, yeah, I mean, it's, look, I suppose there's two ways of looking at life. It can be uh, quite easy and fluid, and it can be difficult and full of challenges. And I suppose the third view is that those things can kind of cuddle each other and kind of coexist together.
Mm-hmm.
And teaching is a great way for me to embrace both of those feelings, I suppose, both of those sets of perceptions. Um, so I I seem to just keep coming back to the fact that I just really love teaching,
Right, right.
and that to me is the principle
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because we know how much money there is to be gained in pursuing Alexander technique as a teacher, and it can sort of sideline and complement our earnings. So the money is not why we do it, um, or at least not the only reason.
It's
And
certainly not a major inducement, is it?
no, so it must have something to do with the being interested in learning and teaching yourself as a teacher.
Right, right.
Uh, and the thing that you were mentioning with Mark about this perceived kind of hierarchical uh, aspect of it, that Alexander teachers seem to know something that other people don't. Um, Look, I mean, I think the the more we become aware of something, the more we drop our mask of how we want to connect with ourselves and connect with society, the more difficult things can get. You get a bit lonelier.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So, uh, my favorite composer, Arnold Schoenberg, used to talk about. He's got a whole article on how I became unpopular or how I learned to lose friends.
Right, right.
And he's referring this to his inherent nature of wanting to follow his individuality. He followed what he heard, and doesn't exactly make you the richest or most popular person on the block, but you know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um,
But that what Mark and I talked about, that sort of um, almost attitude of superiority that sometimes you encounter with Alexander teachers in their view of the general public,
mm,
um, because they know things that other people don't know, or they're aware of things that are highly visible to everyone else, but only they, or only us, I guess, really observe them properly. That's certainly a big issue, I think, in terms of.
yeah. Well, I've had a little bit of a lesson recently. Is that the the children, my children go to piano lessons, and um, I've been going to the piano lessons with them, uh, and I noticed the piano teacher moving and sitting and standing, and she was going here and going there and walking about, and I noticed something kind of interesting, a sort of something interesting in her gait, in her
Hmm.
walking,
Right.
and it was and so then last week my husband took them, and my son said something. It would be interesting if you had sort of carbon graphite fingertips,
Uh-huh.
or something to that effect. And then Helen says, "Well, I actually have carbon graphite leg."
Ah.
So a few years back, this person had cancer and they had to amputate the leg.
Right.
So good on you, Maston, for not deciding for that person what an Alexander technique walk would be like.
Exactly. Yeah. And
Yeah.
and
So.
in that in the conversation I had with Mark, and we were talking about that topic and the sort of superiority topic, and
Mm,
Mark made a point that I hadn't really thought about before a lot, but I've been thinking a lot about it since. And he said his view was that yes, we do know a lot more than most people about a very thin slice of human activity,
Mm.
right? And there are a lot of people who know a lot more than us about other slices or have greater abilities than us in other slices. And that really got me thinking and looking around at people I know who do other things, and and realizing that some of them are just doing amazing things that I would have no idea how to do or would not have the stamina or the patience to do.
Mm.
And it really, every time I see someone in action doing something like that, it kind of is a little lesson in humility for me. And I
Right.
think it has a little bit affected my attitude. I think I overcame the most obvious worst aspects of that earlier, but I think there was some lingering superiority hanging in there, maybe.
Mm.
And I think I've let go of a lot of that just as a result of that comment by Mark.
Hmm.
So I need to tell him how important that was.
Oh, that's a beautiful story.
Yeah. So, do you have any other attitudes in mind to talk about,
Attitudes.
to discuss?
Well,
Or
not
any other things to talk about?
regarding teaching and learning.
Yeah. Well, teachers' attitudes. Yeah.
Um. Well, I suppose there's the aspects around, excuse me, how movement training is perceived, and different schools of movement training out there, and how they can complement the Alexander technique.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm not
Oh,
sure if
oh,
this that
so you well, no,
so
that I think that would
yeah.
be very interesting. So, my take on that is a lot of times Alexander teachers will have an attitude that the technique is, in a sense, better or more basic than any of the others. That kind of thing. Is that what you're referring
Well,
to?
yeah, I mean, there's a series of books I think that came out in the 70s, starting with The Inner Game of Tennis,
Mm-hmm.
and so then I think there's The Inner Game of Music,
Right.
and the gentleman, I'm sorry, I forgot his name.
But I know who you mean. There's
Yeah,
actually kind of an inner game. There was an inner game of just about everything at one point.
yeah, and
Uh,
there's a video on YouTube where he's teaching a group of people who actually have been leading pretty sedentary lifestyles how to play tennis.
mm-hmm.
And so I looked at this 20-minute video. I encourage you to watch it. It's a lot of fun. Just maybe Google inner game of tennis.
Right.
And that took me back to reading Alexander's chapter on the golfer who couldn't keep his eye on the ball.
Right. This is in his
Y-
third book, Use of the Self,
Yeah,
I
and
believe. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
so then I realized that what Alexander is talking about in that chapter specifically is the inner game.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish I had the book in front of me, but teachers and students can go and look it up. It's a short chapter, and there's a point where he's talking about just let the person make some mistakes. Let them move a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
Let them move a little bit, and then approach it again, and you just have this kind of give and take.
Mm-hmm.
But because I think of the language that Alexander was best at using, and I think it's for what he was expressing was an excellent set of I suppose ethos.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I After having watched the Inner Game and realizing that I'd read Inner Game of Music somewhere around mid early 90s, I realized that I was misunderstanding, or perhaps I was tempted to misunderstand what Alexander's talking about, especially in this chapter. Is just he's actually talking about flow, but you need to slow it down to understand your habits.
Mm-hmm.
And also, sometimes you just need to move to understand your habits in a kind of a more peripheral way.
Uh-huh.
You know,
Right.
yeah. A couple of times in my teaching, I said, okay, well, let's look at the problems that you're mentioning with neck pain or back discomfort. Let's just look at it from a really simple perspective. We'll just sit and stand, and I'll just stand here on the side. And I remind them that actors in acting school observe each other move, and there's nothing wrong with this. So
Right,
I,
right.
so I said, yeah, okay, yeah, you sit and you stand. I said, well, you seem to be doing that movement really, really well. Obviously, you know how to do that movement really well. So now I'll just put my hands in a couple of bony parts of your back and just notice what you notice. And it's been actually really nice to take the pressure off myself and not getting there and say, well, there's this thing called the primary control.
Hmm. Right, right,
And
right.
and then a few minutes into it, I start by little give him a new experience of head balancing on top of the spine. And I said, now maybe does that feel really different from where you really usually want to go? And they're like, yeah, actually it does. But their bodies, almost their mind especially, has been kind of primed to go there, to be accepting of it, and to be safe to go there because it's been a few minutes and we maybe joke a little bit and laugh a little bit. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
and then I realized that maybe that's what Alexander wanted the golf teacher to do with the person, to engage their whole self rather than to just say, hey, you gotta keep your eyes on the ball.
Hmm. Hmm.
Forget about everything else.
Right.
Keep your eyes on the ball. And that's what Alexander is he's criticizing. He's saying, well, actually, let's look at the whole thing. And then as a result of that, the person is able to keep their eyes on the ball if they wish to.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, and I think perhaps in the way that Feldenkrais method is taught, there's a lot more room for the person to learn through their own mistakes and through their own experience.
Hmm. Yes,
And and
absolutely. Yeah.
and I think it's a lot nicer when I've experienced Alexander work like that, when I've been allowed this safe space to just mess up a little bit.
Hmm. And
Uh,
and so you maybe, well, would you agree that a lot of teachers, a lot of Alexander teachers are not teaching with quite that approach?
um, I don't know because
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know actually.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think there are certain styles of teaching that don't allow for a lot of that. Is
Um,
my sense.
well, there's probably certain styles of teaching in physiotherapy or Pilates that don't allow for that
Sure.
either. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, I've learned, I suppose, mostly through martial arts practice, especially that the self-image or the experience um, is not really static. So if I have experienced that kind of thing in the past with a certain person, um, look, they could have changed, and I could have changed.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
can I even bring up that past exchange and sort of almost like change it
Hmm. Hmm.
to yeah, to help myself out, to give myself a little bit more insight and liveliness. Um,
So would you describe that as a kind of a loosening up in terms of your attitudes towards whatever teaching procedure you're using? If you are using a teaching procedure like chair work or monkey or whatever, that you're suggesting maybe don't be so hung up on getting it exactly the way you want it all the time.
um, yeah, I suppose Alexander kept coming back to the idea of process in italics.
Hmm.
Uh, to me, that to me that translates into the way we doing things.
Hmm.
Means whereby the way we approach the situation.
Mm.
And I think he's very implicit in more than one situation that if if the way you're approaching something is fixed, then you become fixed.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, yeah.
So and I think that goes back to my martial arts practice and some of the challenges teachers in that realm have experienced and how they overcome them,
Hmm.
and how they teach me to, um, well, I could say it in negative words, or I could just say, um, well, think for yourself.
Nice. Yeah.
um, it's yeah. I think I think it could be a good way of approaching social problems as well. We can talk a
Right.
lot about how we should legalize this or illegalize that or cut that budget or not. But what can we do that's positive? Can we just get on with it and think for ourselves and let the teaching situation be what it will be?
Hmm.
But it won't come out of the person that no one will decide that or be driven to that in the moment of being met by the stimulus unless they've gone to a certain amount of rigor.
Hmm.
Yeah,
You're talking
so
about the teacher.
sure, yeah,
Yeah, the teacher
yeah.
the teacher needs to be properly trained
Well,
or be
yeah,
trained. Yeah.
yeah, and I actually really see this clearly enough in my mind today to know that even if someone, a teacher and under graduation decides that, hey, I'm going to be this kind of teacher. I'm going to be really loose and really free. And yeah, I'm going to just like, everyone's just going to love me.
Right.
And they decided to approach the game of communication, teaching and learning from that plateau.
Hmm.
Once they're met with the stimulus,
Right.
the only thing that's going to come out is what is inherent in their nature.
Right.
And if they want to go there to that loose and free kind of, hey, let's make some mistakes kind of plateau, which is not exactly what I'm saying is right for everyone or right for any, you know, I'm
Hmm.
not even sure if it's, I've probably changed my mind in a few years about all of this. But what I'm saying is that once we are met with the stimulus at the moment of the teaching and learning, we can't fake that, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know, what we have cultivated in ourselves will will guide us through a set of procedures and principles, and the how of it, the how of what we do will be guided with the place we are at that moment. So this takes a certain amount of honesty and humility to be okay with how much you know and how much you don't know, how much you've worked on yourself and how much you still are able to work on yourself still. And I suppose it's a continuum.
Right.
Yeah?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
But
in general, teachers who've been teaching a long time and are comfortable teaching are probably more likely to veer off in unexpected directions in their teaching than a new teacher.
yeah, okay. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, they have, you in a sense, have the freedom to do that because well, who can explain it? But it just, that's certainly been my experience that the longer I teach, the more different my lessons get in a way,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I do things now that I wouldn't could never have imagined doing 20 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
And so is there anything else on this topic that you want to bring up? We're kind of probably getting to a logical end, unless you have some other point you want to
Um,
make.
no, just regarding that last thing that I said, and
Yeah.
it's definitely onwards and upwards process, at least for me.
Right. Right.
Yes. So I haven't come to a conclusion about
Well, I
any of
haven't
it.
either.
Yeah.
But it certainly not yet. I'll let you know
That's the
when.
only conclusion that I haven't come up with
Right.
the conclusion.
Right. Right. But I don't know. What would you say is the big message in our conversation
Um,
for teachers to think about?
to think about being okay with where where you've landed on the floor in that moment of the responding to the student, and to cultivate a little bit of yourself every day towards more flexibility and stability. So, um, like you said, like you've done things in the past 20 years that you wouldn't have thought of doing, or you wouldn't have thought would have just come up on their own even,
Mm-hmm.
um, that have helped bring more richness and more life to how you interact.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess you could say that if you're really really honestly working on yourself, which is I think a good thing for Alexander teachers to do on an ongoing basis, that part of you is a student in that situation.
Oh, all of me is a student.
Well, all of you, but maybe not all of me. But I mean the point is that you are both in a sense teaching and learning stuff yourself, and maybe that's a pretty useful thing to be in touch with when you're working with someone who's officially defined as being a student.
Yes, yes.
Well, maybe that's where we should end. What do you think?
Sounds good.
Although I do want to come back to what Mark said. We may be really good at a certain a slice of human activity, but
Yeah,
boy, there are plenty of people out there who are way better than us at all kinds of things. And I think
sure.
if you open your eyes to that,
Yeah.
um, you'll see it everywhere. And that was my big revelation from that conversation. Well,
Yeah,
maybe
so
I think this is
yeah.
a good place to stop.
That sounds good.
All right,
Very
so
enjoyable.
it's been fun. Yeah, my guest today has been Mastena Nazarian, an Alexander Technique teacher in Melbourne, Australia. I'll put a link to her site by the interview. If you're intrigued by her approach to teaching and you're in the Melbourne area, give her a call. Thank you so much, Mastena.
Thank you, Robert.